Assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome to another Project Illumine Tafsir. Today we're going to be doing Surah Al-Mulk. I'm standing in for Grace today as she's not here with us, which are big shoes to fill. Right, Sheikh? So anyways, I was wondering what I should talk about in my intro because Grace usually shares so many great experiences and stories with us. So I thought, okay, let me talk about how I met Sheikh and Grace and my experience with Usuli. I actually met Sheikh and Grace about 9 years ago, so it's been a while, and actually met through my husband, Rami, who's actually here too, and he was studying with Sheikh at the time at UCLA, doing a master's, and so Sheikh and Grace invited us to the halaqah they do in LA, and at first I was unsure because I was like a typical kind of jaded Muslim, I confess. I had so many, bad experiences in the community trying to take classes, like the weekend seminars and the mosque classes and join local halaqahs, and everything was always quite mediocre and, kind of just the same material recycled from halaqah to seminar to class. And so I was really uninspired, honestly, by what was offered. And then when I did find a halaqah that I thought would be a great fit for me, it was a women's halaqah. This is in Orange County, California. They said it was invitation only. So this was kind of my experience with like growing up and like looking for classes or some sort of education to, further my knowledge of Islamic studies or of the Quran, anything. I was just desperate to learn anything. And even, at that point, I was very jaded by my experiences at the masjid and kind of like turned off some of like the leadership at the masjid. And so like this was basically my attitude coming to the halaqah with Sheikh and Grace. But basically after this experience, we showed up to the halaqah and my life completely changed. I'm not kidding. Like from that day now, almost 10 years later, my life has never been the same, but in a good way. I think one of the things that is, I'm the daughter of a convert, and so one of the things that was always an obstacle is, you don't understand Arabic, and so how are you going to understand the Quran? You're not going to understand it, and there was also a lack of motivation to teach me because I didn't understand Arabic. And so that was also one of the obstacles that I would always face. And when I went to this first halaqah with Grace and Sheikh in their home, it was like the safe place where you could be curious, you could ask questions, nothing was a stupid question, and Sheikh knows I've asked many stupid questions, even if he doesn't admit it. But that's really a lot of the experience we have here, which I feel like people who are joining on Interactive or on YouTube and stuff, you guys don't really get to experience with us, is it's become the safe space where I've never felt this before, where I can ask anything and be curious. I don't have to know Arabic. You can start anywhere on your journey, whether you knew the Quran, you don't, whether you're a convert, whether you thought you knew everything and you realize you don't, especially being next to Sheikh, mashallah. So, coming to this first halaqah, and I had come to the terms that I would never really understand the Quran after all these experiences. And, fast forward 10 years now, taking this Project Illumine program and being a student here, it's completely changed my life. In so many ways, I think I'm going to get emotional. He always does this to me. Oh my god. I think. This is actually one point I want to make, is that in all the Quran programs that I've tried to attend or tafsir that I've tried to read myself, I've actually never been touched and really not just cried but wept over what I was learning, like my experience here. Sorry. It's tears of joy because I never thought that I would experience something like that, and it was something I craved. And it was because of Sheikh. This is the testimony. I don't know what it is. Give me the tissues. Hold on a second. This is not going well, Grace. Come back.
It's going fine.
It's so embarrassing, but I know I had planned what I was gonna say, and it's just going crazy now. But like, that was one of the things I craved, and that I felt like I was missing growing up, like not feeling like I was welcome in these spaces because I didn't know Arabic or I didn't understand the culture, because there's all this cultural baggage that comes, I feel like, sometimes when you want to pursue Islam. And, I feel like when I came here to Usuli Institute, and even just knowing Grace and the professor for so many years, like I always felt like a valued kind of member of their community. And even here, like I'm in the fashion space, and which are like the arts, and I've never seen someone appreciate the arts so much as Grace and the professor, and make me feel like, oh my God, you're doing such important work in the arts, because I feel like being a doctor or a lawyer, it's a great job too, but I feel like it's almost like frowned upon to go into the arts. And they've really like nurtured, I feel like, every student that's been here and our own individual talents, where it's not only that we're just studying the Quran, but we're also like kind of nurturing our Muslim identity in the spaces that we exist in. And so, with all this experience and the tears and everything else, I feel like that's why it really, pains me to see that, like, for instance, we haven't raised all the money we want for our tafsir program. Like, I think we're almost like, less than 100 people away from reaching our goal. And for me, like, I feel like a huge responsibility and like almost like a burden with each halaqah, like, oh my gosh, like this is on us to continue forward and to publish and to like take somewhere, like Sheikh always talks about, you're going to be judged by how you treated your scholars, and Sheikh is one of those. In my eyes, Sheikh is like the biggest, most prominent scholar in the Western world. Like, I mean, and look, we can't even raise the funds for the Quran project. Like, that's a shame. And that's on us, for us to really try and reach out to people, even if we don't have money to donate, but to even talk to people about what they learned. Like, if a khutbah inspired you about, social justice issues, which Sheikh is always talking about, which I love about this space, because a lot of people don't touch these issues, then share the khutbah with someone. If a halaqah inspired you to pick up the Quran again and, study and try to understand it in a different way, share that with somebody. Even just like sharing the work that we're doing here, I think is so important, even if you don't have money to donate or you don't have time to volunteer. Because, even just volunteering would be like extremely helpful in our mission to publish this tafsir. And for me, I think like just even in a personal way, in terms of how important education is and supporting knowledge. Like, we have so many masjids, alhamdulillah, but how many education institutes do we have? Like, really, that are actually impressive in doing a good work in that, or not, like, if anything, with separate agendas and, have Islamophobic tendencies. Like, name one that you're really impressed with. And that's also why I really love Usuli Institute. Like, Rami, my husband, he's been on this path for like 10 years, pursuing academia. This is like his 6th degree. Not once, I think actually maybe just once, he got a scholarship, and it was like for $2,000. Like, we know how difficult this path is, pursuing knowledge and academia, and how it's very lonely and nobody supports you, especially in the community, because it's not a very traditional kind of field. I even remember when Rami started studying, they're like, you're studying Islam? That's like a field? Like, it was so foreign 10 years ago, especially. And so, like, okay, if we're not going to study or promote scholarship and try to support these new kind of wave of students who want to study and learn, then we have a sheikh right here that has dedicated his life to knowledge and mastering every single subject that he's ever read. And, but we still haven't fundraised the money. Like, that for me is heartbreaking and like pains me. And I feel like that's what I really wanted to talk about today is, we have the masjids, but what about our institutions of knowledge? And someone like Sheikh Abu Fadl, like, it's a shame if we go through all this time to have these halaqas weekly, and then we don't end up publishing anything. We don't raise the money to even finish the program, especially when we're 100 donors away. Like, I think that for us is, the priority, especially in fighting Islamophobia. Like, we're going to fight Islamophobia with knowledge and information and access to resources like Sheikh's library. And I think that's the future of Islam and what we need to hand down to future generations, so that when these Gen Z kids, which happens to me all the time, 18-year-olds, come and have questions about, well, what does this mean? Someone came up to me and said this, and they don't know how to answer it, but they don't even know who to ask to answer it. Sheikh is doing this work all the time. So that's just my plug for Usuli. Thank you for coming on this, this intro. And Sheikh, you can take it from here.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وتابعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So, inshallah, today we will do Surah Mulk. I don't know if this is. I had in the back of my mind that if we do Surah Al-Mulk and it doesn't take us a lot of time, then we can also do Surah Al-A'la. I don't know if that's unrealistic. And we haven't succeeded in doing more than one surah since we began this project. So, but if it happens, it might allow us to catch up on some lost time, because we're behind schedule. But let's see, inshallah, we'll see. Okay, so Surah Al-Mulk, it is by all accounts, it is a Meccan surah, so that much is clear. There are reports that Surah Al-Mulk was revealed after Surah Al-Tur. If so, if Surah Al-Mulk is revealed after Surah Al-Tur, then in order of revelation it would be 76, 77, 78, something like that. But this presents us with a little bit of a challenge, because if it is revealed after Surah Al-Tur, then it is a late Meccan revelation, and it would have been revealed after Surah Al-Isra. And not only that, but it would actually be revealed after many of the surah we discussed. It would be revealed after Surah Al-Zumar, Surah Fussilat, which we've talked about. It would be revealed after Surah Al-Zukhruf. And indeed would even be revealed after Surah Al-Kahf or Surah Nuh or Al-Nahl. Nahl, we've discussed in Nahl. We haven't talked about the Kahf or Nuh. Okay, so, but Surah Al-Mulk in character reads more like a mid-Meccan surah, a pre-Isra surah. In style, in theme, in many levels, and there are reports that say that Surah Al-Mulk was revealed in mid-Meccan period, so before Isra. Does this make a difference? Well, it does, but in a subtle way. Surah Al-Mulk, as we will see inshallah in a second, is underscored as one of the surah that the Prophet ﷺ emphasized that Muslims must memorize, must teach, must internalize, and it is easy to understand why. As a surah, it sums up the heart of Islamic Aqidah, the heart of Islamic creed, in a succinct and powerful fashion. It is, in terms of balagha or in terms of eloquence, it is a profoundly beautiful surah. And if it is revealed right before the hijrah, then it would be not just Surah Al-Mulk, but Surah Al-Mulk and a number of other surah that we have the same type of question, like Al-Haqqa or Al-Ma'arij or Al-Naba. If they were revealed right before the hijrah, then the import of that would be that right before Muslims were about to embark on this new phase of the Islamic da'wah, it is as if Allah was underscoring. It is as if, the way best put it is, as if after you have a number of nuanced and multi-layered surahs, like Zumar, like Safat is among them as well, actually. So like Fussilat, like Zukhruf, then you have a summation of the Islamic creed right before the hijrah again. It's like saying, and here is the sort of the synopsis, the essence of the thing. It's like when you make an argument in court, or you make and so you have the heart of your argument, where you go through all the rebuttals and responses, and then you have a synopsis at the very end where you sum up your pleadings. What's the point of your entire discourse? That's if in fact Surah Al-Mulk is right before the hijrah. If Surah Al-Mulk is from the middle period, then that thesis about surahs sort of anchoring or presenting the summation of Islamic theology right before the hijrah, that thesis would be far less sustainable. Because then Surah Al-Mulk and other surah that were revealed, we know for sure were revealed close to Al-Mulk, would be from the middle period, and then it would be part of the surah that were expounding the Islamic creed as events were heating up to what we know was going to be the escalation of persecution and so on. My heart tells me that this surah is from the end of the Meccan period, right before the hijrah. Although I have to admit that I'm choosing my words very purposely, that my heart tells me, because the evidence is unclear. It's really, if you look at the riwayat, the various narrations, and you trace who narrated what, and under what circumstances, and you put the evidence all and you evaluate it, it's very difficult to say that the evidence points in a probability type of, is it more probable that it's this way or that way? It's probably the evidence is equal. But my heart tells me it's towards the late period, Meccan period, but Allahu A'lam. Only Allah knows best. This point will become clear. If you didn't catch everything I was saying, it will become clear as, especially as we talk about other surah that were revealed around Surah Al-Mulk, or that are, we know were among the revelations that were close to Surah Al-Mulk. And this whole notion of whether there was a summation, can you pass me the, whether there was a summation before the Hijrah, I think will become clear, inshallah. Okay. So, first to situate, we have a lot of ahadith about Surah Al-Mulk and the place of Surah Al-Mulk. Some of the hadiths, as always, some are not very reliable, others are far more reliable. But before I get to the hadith about Surah Al-Mulk, Surah Al-Mulk is one of these surahs that had a number of competing potential names or titles to the surah. So in some reports it was called Surah Tabarak. Other reports it was called Surah Al-Waqiyah. Yet other reports it was called Surah Al-Munjiyah. But it is clear that all of these did not survive, and they never became widespread. And in all the actual written copies of the Quran that are extant, that survived, it was designated as Surah Al-Mulk. Although it will become clear why some of the names were suggested, why it was called Al-Waqiyah or Al-Munjiyah or Tabarak. Of course, it's obvious because of the language of the surah itself, or it's from the surah. But the others, Al-Waqiyah and Al-Munjiyah, we'll talk about. So some of the ahadith reported about Surah Al-Mulk are ones in which the Prophet ﷺ describes Surah Al-Mulk describes it as a Munjiyah. Munjiyah means a surah that saves, and saves in particular in these hadiths from Azab al-Qabr, from the torments of the grave. In other narrations, it is described as al-Waqiyah, or the protector. And again, protector from what? It's protector from Azab al-Qabr. So whether it's described as the Waqiyah, the protector, or al-Munjiyah, the savior, a lot of traditions focus on this issue of that those who have recited Surah Al-Mulk in their lifetime repeatedly and persistently, those who memorize Surah Al-Mulk and recite it in prayer, that it helps them when they stand judgment right after death. Having said this, and although you find in a lot of tafsir, they'll tell you that they'll recite these ahadith, or they'll quote these ahadith, and they will assert this as a fact. It is clear, the evidence is clear that the Prophet ﷺ recited Surah Al-Mulk repeatedly in many prayers, and in some reports he even would recite it daily, before every night. And it is also clear that he underscored for Muslims the importance of Surah Al-Mulk for their own spiritual health, for their own salvation, but the part that a lot of these ahadith, in my opinion, especially that tell you that the surah will protect from azab al-qabr, or from judgment in the grave, they seem to have originated as opinions of companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and then in due time were attributed to the Prophet as ahadith. So, for instance, in a tradition from Ibn Abbas is reported to have been talking to one of his students, and he says, ألا أتحفك بحديث تفرح به? Shall I tell you something shall I teach you something that would bring you joy, or that would be good news? So his student reportedly then, of course, as these reports go, say yes. And Ibn Abbas says, اقرأ تبارك الذي بيده الملك وعلمها أهلك وجميع ولدك وصبيان بيتك وجيرانك فإنها المنجية المجادلة تجادل يوم القيامة عن ربها، تجادل يوم القيامة عند ربها لقارئها، وتطلب له أن ينجيه الله من عذاب النار وينجو بها صاحبها من عذاب القبر. فقد سمعت رسول الله يقول لوددت أنها في قلب كل إنسان من أمتي. So what Ibn Abbas is saying is that he tells the student, shall I teach you something that is very good for you? The student says yes. He said, read Surah Al-Mulk. Read here means recite it frequently. And teach it to your children. And teach it to your household. And teach it to even your neighbors. Because it is the surah that will avail you, or that will help you in the hereafter. And it is the surah that will testify on your behalf in front of your God in the hereafter. And it is the surah that will save you from the judgment in the grave, azab al-qabr, or punishment in the grave. And then he says, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, I wish that Surah Al-Mulk was deeply anchored in the hearts of everyone in my ummah. A lot of the hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ about Azab al-Qabr raise issues of authenticity. And so to sum up this, while I doubt that the Prophet ﷺ said that Surah al-Mulk is going to be your protector in the grave, that Surah al-Mulk will protect you in the grave. But it is clear from numerous reports that the Prophet ﷺ emphasized the importance of Surah al-Mulk, the importance of reading it, the importance of memorizing it, the importance of teaching it, the importance of internalizing it. And it is easy to understand why once you memorize Surah al-Mulk. It is not really surprising, because it captures the Islamic creed, and the very heart of it in 30 remarkably eloquent verses. Okay, so let's then start with the surah itself. So, تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. تبارك, I'm reading from the study Quran. Blessed is God. So the Quran says, whose hands lies sovereignty. Where God is powerful over all things, who created death and life, that God may try you as to which of you is most virtuous indeed. And God is the mighty, the forgiving. First, Tabarak. We often translate Tabarak as blessed, although it's not. To say that God is blessed is theologically, from an Islamic perspective, problematic. And it is not, Tabarak is not really blessed in the sense that you get from the English language. التبارك هو تعالى وتعاظم. تعالى وتعاظم means to be, it is acknowledging or attesting to that God's glory, God by God's nature, بالذات والصفات, by nature and attributes, is not within the realm of comparison to the created world. Linguistically, al-baraka is tanasub al-ajsam. Baraka is a word that connotes proportionality of bodies. It compares something to something. So when you say baraka jamal, the origin of that would mean the camel has sat. Because you're describing positionality. So when you use that form, tabarak, tafa'al, you are using a form that's saying that in relation to everything else, Allah is far superior, and continuously superior, and continuously in a position of beyond comparison. We'll see, as we'll see, if you've those of you who read Arabic, if you've looked at something like Tafsir al-Razi, you'll find when Surah al-Mulk, al-Razi goes into extended discussions, philosophical discussions about some of the things I'm going to mention, because of the language of Surah Tabarak itself, or Surah Al-Mulk, sorry, which raises these philosophical questions about how one can talk about God and the relation of God, the relation of the uncreated to the created world. Although, of course, we're not going to get into these. I mean, you could spend a very, very long time going through Razi's discussions on, and to a lesser extent, someone like al-Maturidi, when in his tafsir, when he talks about the same surah. One of the very interesting things is that Surah Al-Mulk became sort of the platform upon which the Mu'tazila and Ash'ariyya and Maturidiyya had some of their most intense philosophical debates. And it's very interesting because there are certain surah in the Quran where they became the battlefield for these theological orientations, and Surah Al-Mulk was definitely right in the heart of it. Okay. So Tabarak, it is important that we internalize. Not, it's easy just to say, oh, glory be to God, or blessing. I don't like the word blessing because it's a little bit heretical, but it is to understand that when you say Tabarak, that what you are acknowledging is that God is beyond the logic of the created world. So you are also acknowledging that when it comes to God, questions like, well, where did God come from? Or what is the fate of God? Or what does eternity mean? All of these questions that are superimposed from the created world onto the uncreated world are invalid. And there is no way to answer them, because there is no frame of reference within our universe of meanings for us to answer these questions. Okay. الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. The tafsir usually spend a lot of time talking about why does it say الذي بيده الملك, whose mulk is in God's hands, as opposed to say, for instance, الذي له الملك, or Tabaraka, why does it specify biyadihi and mulk? And I don't think this discussion is very interesting, to be quite honest with you. Although a lot of time spent on it, it's a distinction without difference, because anyone that knows anything about the style of the Quran, as long as you don't believe in amorphism, where you actually believe that God has a hand, then you understand that all of this is used to use human language to connote meanings that are close to the human intellect. So, Tabarak, that whose all sovereignty, Mulk, before I move beyond this, there's something I forgot. We often, theologically, some people ask, what is the difference in the Quranic usage between Subhan, if you said, for instance, Subhanallah as Tabarak, as opposed to Tabarak, what is the difference between Tasbih and Tabarruk? I'll say it in Arabic first. Al-baraka tanasub al-ajsam. والتسبيح هو تنزه يناسب المجردات. So what this means is, baraka is saying, as to all material things, God is beyond materiality. Tasbih is, as to all non-material things, God is beyond non-materiality. So God in Tasbih is beyond all non-material meanings. And in Tabarruk, God is beyond all material concrete things. Okay. So, بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير, who Mulk is ultimate sovereignty, ultimate the power of disposing and deciding as to what transpires within the created world. And as we said before, the Mulk exists as opposed to the Malakut. The Malakut is the world of Ghaib, the world of the unseen. The Mulk is the created world. And because we are talking about Mulk, i.e. the material created world, the ayah starts out with Tabarak, as opposed to Subhanallah biyadihi al-malakut, for instance. Nothing is beyond Allah's ability. I want to make sure. As they say, بيده التصرف التام. A testament of faith that anything that exists either because Allah made it directly so, or Allah permitted it to be so. Now, when I say that there are these intense theological debates between the Mu'tazila and Ash'ariyah and others, it is exactly around this point. Do things exist because Allah allowed them to be so, or is it because created them to be so? And especially what they argue about in particular is whether God creates things, whether any acts or possibilities that are not good, meaning evil, whether they are possibly created by God or not. But وهو على كل شيء قدير has absolute ability over anything. Okay. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. Immediately, the very point of your existence, the very purpose of creation, is set forth in Surah Mulk. The reason we are on earth is to demonstrate deeds. But notice here, created death and life. Now, in traditional tafsir, Razi is a very good example. You have a long discussion about what is death and what is life. Part of the reason that you have this discussion is because of some hadith traditions that assert that death is an actual created being. And I forgot which, taking what form now, but I don't put much weight on this hadith, to be honest with you, but you'll find it in all the traditional tafsir that death is an actual created being, and wherever it goes and whoever it touches, it kills. Some, especially in Sufi-esque tafsir, they interpret this hadith anecdotally, but I don't think it's an authentic hadith in any case. But when I say Razi goes into a discussion, like a lot of, like Maturidi also goes into a long discussion about what is death, it's an actual long established philosophical debate in the Islamic tradition about what is the nature of consciousness and what is the nature of the absence of consciousness. Does it make a difference? Yes, it makes a difference, because what is the state of death? Is it exactly the same state we came from before the moment of birth? Or is it a state something between what we came from before birth and what we experience in life? So it's neither, you have no consciousness whatsoever about what you are before you were born, right? And then you have full consciousness in life. Is death something in between these two? Can we say that in death some people are actually in a state of rest and sleep, so they actually experience nothing, while others are in a state of semi-consciousness and lost, sort of caught in a fog? these are why you have this entire discourse in the Islamic tradition, and Surah al-Mulk often became the locus for these long discussions about the nature of death and the nature. Now, I'm not going to get into these discussions. I mean, if someone wants to ask a question about it in the end, be my guest. But they are distinctively philosophical. I mean, they are. They belong to a certain genre of medieval philosophy. And that gives it a certain taste that might be very surprising for a lot of modern Muslims. Anyway, so we can move on. But, so gave you life and death, ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. Best in deeds. When the Prophet ﷺ was asked about this verse, أيكم أحسن عملا, because a number of companions of the Prophet ﷺ said, ask questions, well, is it a matter of who prays the most, who fasts the most, and especially that later on in Medina, and this hadith does come from Medina, so it was asked long after this surah was revealed. We had the class of people known as the Qurra, who would dedicate themselves to doing nothing but increasing their a'mal, increasing their deeds. And so the question became, well, so is this what the verse is talking about? So is it a matter of what, number of prayers prayed, number of days fasted, and so on. So the Prophet ﷺ was asked about the specific verse, and there are two main versions reported as to what he said. In version number 1, his response was, أيكم أحسن, responding to what this verse means, he says, أيكم أحسن عقلا وأرضع عن محارم الله وأسرع في طاعة الله. أيكم أحسن عقلا, you pause there. Which of you is more, can be translated as, which of you is more knowledgeable, possible? Which of you is more wise? Which of you is more reasonable? Which of you is more moral? Some have even suggested that way of understanding it. أيكم أحسن عقلا. So he responds with that first. Why? Because remember, it is not just the deed it's not just doing a deed, but it is the intention behind the deed and the actual effect of the deed. So you can't say, well, I've done a deed and my intentions don't matter. Well, obviously, you have to have the right intention. But you can't also say, well, I have the right intentions, it's just that my deeds have had horrible effects. So, I mean, a typical example, let's say you decide, I want to pray as much as I can. So you are spending your whole time praying extra prayers, but you neglect your work. And because you neglect your work, people suffer. These are the consequences of deeds. So when people commented on ayyukum ahsanu aqla, you have is the Prophet ﷺ saying, which of you is the most knowledgeable, which of you is the most wise, which of you is the most reasonable. Reasonable meaning a person who has the right intent, who thinks about the right consequences, as well as in the context of presenting deeds. And then وَأَرْضَهُ عَنْ مَحَارِمِ اللَّهِ وَأَسْرَعُ فِي طَاعَةِ اللَّهِ. أَرْضَ عَنْ مَحَارِمِ اللَّهِ mean steers away from haram. Steers away from haram meaning that they don't flirt with, things that taking a risk. وَأَسْرَعُ فِي طَاعَةِ اللَّهِ, and their heart is drawn to obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once they become convinced that this is what Allah wants, then that becomes their passion. So that's the first version of the hadith. The second version of the hadith is, again, it starts out with ayyukum ahsanu aqla. So number one, same thing, which of you has the best aql, whether that means knowledge, wisdom, reasonableness, rationality, whatever. أيكم أحسن عقلا وأشدكم لله خوفا وأحسنكم في أمره ونهيه نظرا وإن كانوا أقلكم تطوعا. So in the second version, the Prophet ﷺ says, first, best of you in aql. Second, those most أشدكم لله خوفا, most fearful of God, most keen on doing what is halal. وأحسنكم في أمره ونهيه نظرا. The best of you in understanding what Allah has forbidden and what Allah commands. وَإِن كَانُوا أَقَلُّكُمْ تَطَوُّعًا. And even if, in terms of extra prayers or extra fasting, you actually do less. So the first version and the second version are close, but the second version, you can read it as a historical response to the Qur'an, in that it explicitly is saying, yes, the Qur'an might pray more, yes, the Qur'an might fast more, but they don't have the best understanding. So in the second version, it explicitly says it's not a numbers game. There is no way, and I've studied this for a long time, there's no way where I can tell you in all fairness which of these versions is more accurate as a matter of isnad, as a matter of transmission. In fact, I suspect that the Prophet ﷺ said both at different times because of the way they are related and who reports what when. And I think if he said both at different times, I don't think they're inconsistent. I think they're actually very consistent with one another. What the Prophet, and I don't think necessarily that the Prophet ﷺ was responding to the Qur'an. And that's part of understanding when these hadiths were actually reported. The Qur'an were a phenomena much later after these hadiths. So I don't think you're responding to the Qur'an, as some have said. the phenomena of the Qur'an came later. These are reported in the first and second year of Medina, while the Qur'an are in the eighth and ninth year of Medina. But it's clear what the Prophet ﷺ was conveying. That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, which of you is better not in deeds, as is always translated, but in accomplishments. أحسن عملا, which of you is better in your iman? Which of you is better in your intent? Which of you is better in your taqwa? Which of you is better in your ilm, in your knowledge? Which of you is better in understanding the hikmah behind al-ahkam, the wisdom behind Allah's laws? Which of you is better in achieving al-maqasid al-shar'iyya, in achieving the objectives of Sharia itself? So it's not a numbers game. And of course this becomes important, especially in our modern age, because in our modern age so many of I checked last night one of the what's his name, that tafsir that was published by bin Baz. I mean, it's actually the institution of Saudi scholars back in, I think it was the 80s, but the head of that was bin Baz, and they make it sound very much like it's just a matter of, number of rak'ahs prayed, number of days fasted, and while they quote the same hadith I just told you, but they completely gloss over the interpretive tradition as to this whole debate that I just went through about what amal means. That amal is not in the modern Arabic, standard Arabic sense of just what you do. Amal means your legacy, your actual accomplishments, which incorporate everything, which incorporate your piety, your knowledge, your understanding, but I wish I remembered this hadith when I wrote Reasoning with God, because including the discussion about reasonability would have enriched Reasoning with God. I just didn't remember it when I was writing the book. But it's the heart of what I was talking about in Reasoning with God. It is not a matter of just executing laws, regardless of the consequences. That's not taqwa. Taqwa is understanding the objective, the wisdom of what Allah was telling us and teaching us, and internalizing it and embodying it in the same way as we say at-takhalluq bi khuluqillah, that you embody it, that what comes out of you are the attributes of divinity. So you are a walking embodiment of godliness in existence. Okay, وهو العزيز الغفور. I remember there was something about it, but I don't remember what. Maybe it will come to me. There was something about but it's not. I'm not remembering it. Um, this is in two. وهو العزيز الغفور. It's translated in the study Quran as He is the mighty and the forgiving. الذي خلق سبع سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير. Now, the verse I just read 3 and 4. Okay, so created sab'a samawat. Sab'a samawat is usually translated 7 heavens. Samawat are literally are skies. The truth is, we don't know what the 7 skies are, and in my view, Allahu A'lam, but in my view, we will never know what the 7 skies are. And let me explain this. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that created 7 samawat. And tibaq. Tibaq could be one on top of another or one following another. And ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت means there is no, التفاوت here is no gaps, no separation, no demarcation, nothing that would create or nothing that would constitute a boundary or a barrier or a marker between one and the other. Now, we don't know in truth whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about dimensions, or Allah is talking about, are we talking about like that the entire universe is the entire universe as we know it is within a what do you call this
bubble atmosphere?
Like a bubble. Yeah, like and then there are, so in the traditional tafsir they talk about whether al-arsh, the throne of the divine, whatever it is, wherever it exists, whether it is in a sama in itself. Are the stars that we see all within sama al-dunya, the single heaven of earth, the sky that surrounds the earth? Or is it within other heavens but seen through the heavens of earth? We don't know if it's talking about dimensions, if it's talking about a progression of time where the universe develops from one stage to another, and that's what's referred to as sab'a samawat tibaq, because past, present, and future ceases to make sense the further away we get from the realm of Earth and Earth's gravity. So what, and I mean, although you find a lot of speculative material, what I think we can clearly reject, and this is not just me, but even our ancestors long ago, hundreds of years ago, rejected the idea that each planet occupies a sama' min as-samawat. The old idea was, that used to have some acceptance, was that Saturn occupies one heaven, and Jupiter occupies another heaven, and whatever. That idea was rejected a long time ago. So these two verses tells you to invite human beings to gaze upon the heavens and to try to see whether in fact you can see any gaps or separators between one heaven and another. And it tells you that the inevitable result is that you will be frustrated. ينقلب إليك البصر وهو خاسئ وهو حسير means that after you look again and again to try to see these separators or any gaps or any... Now, Allah doesn't say, look at creation, try to catch a mistake. So when Allah says, ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت, you will not find gaps. In my opinion, what Allah is saying is, you will not find demarkers or boundaries or separators. And Allah, when Allah says, ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير, means that you will examine it time and time again, but you will in fact not see what is one heaven from another. Did everyone follow this? Because a lot of the tafsir you read, well, actually all the tafsir you read, they'll tell you, what it's telling you is, look at the heavens, you'll see that it's made perfectly without any mistakes. But that's silly. When does Allah tell us try to catch a mistake? Well, it's obvious there are no mistakes. I mean, because any mistake would all be dead. The nature of the universe is such that any little mistake, life would perish. What I believe Allah is saying is that look at the heavens and try to see any demarcations, any separators between one heaven and another. You won't see it. So in other words, human beings, will never be able to see the difference between one heaven and another, or one sama' and another. Those who try to say, well, one sama is defined by the ozone layer, and then the next sama is defined by, I don't know, it's not, it's all speculative and not convincing. Okay. And this is, by the way, consistent with the thrust of Surah Al-Mulk, which tells you that you are such a small part of what Allah has created, and your existence on earth, although you don't realize this, but it is completely within Allah's absolute sovereignty, as we will see where that will take us. Okay. Alright. وَلَقَدْ زَيَّنَّا سَمَاءَ الدُّنْيَا بِمَصَابِيحَ وَجَعَلْنَاهَا رُجُومًا لِلشَّيَاطِينِ وَأَعْتَدْنَا لَهُمْ عَذَابَ السَّعِيرِ وَلِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ عَذَابُ جَهَنَّمَ وَبِئْسَ الْمَصِيرُ. وَلَقَدْ زَيَّنَّا سَمَاءَ الدُّنْيَا. This is verse now 5. Truly we have adorned the lowest heaven with lamps and made them missiles against the Satans. And we have prepared for them the punishment of the blaze. Very literal. Okay. Notice سماء الدنيا زينا سماء الدنيا بمصابيح. That's another thing that's consistent with what I'm saying. You know, is it that everything that we see from the earth is just one bubble, and that's one bubble is just one heaven? Because it tells you that surrounds the earth is full of planets and stars. So if all of that is one heaven, then where are the rest? It is clearly beyond what we, our realm, or our realm of experience, or our realm of verification. Anyway, okay. وَجَعَلْنَاهَا رُجُومًا لِلشَّيَاطِينِ. We know elsewhere that also the Quran says, mentions in several places, in 3 different parts of the Quran, the idea of that the heavens are geared to block demons out. And we know from elsewhere that the Quran tells us that if, from Surah Saba, that if demons would, or was it Surah Jinn? Jinn. That demons, when they would attempt to listen to the affairs of the throne, that they would be chased away with a fiery projectile, whatever that fiery projectile is. What's very interesting is that among the old people, often throughout the history of Islam, there were always critics of the Quran, and there were always groups of whether they were whether they belonged to another religious faith, or whether they were technically Muslim but in reality atheists. This ayah is one of the ayat that, although in the modern age it doesn't get a lot of discussion, but over the centuries, it used to be among the favorite ayat that whether apostates or atheists or sometimes Sabians or Mantians would attack the Quran on. And in part because it says that the atmosphere of earth has masabih, and the way even the study Quran translates it is with lamps, and made them missiles against the Satans. And what they would say is, wait, but we look up and we see a star, and that star remains where it is. So how could that star be a missile against a Satan? Because if that's true, then the star would shoot and then disappear. So that was one. The other was, if jinn is made from fire, then how could jinn be burned by fire? With the passage of time, with Islamophobes usually pick on other things. So this no longer became one of the... But what I'll say about this ayah is the following, is that linguistically, it does not mean that the masabih themselves are necessarily that shoots after demons. But fire or shuhb from the masabih, fire that comes from whatever they are, stars, suns, and in truth we don't know in that realm, because it's a realm of ghaib. It's not the realm of our experienced life. What does it mean for a demon to try to spy? What does it mean for a demon to overhear angels? What does it mean for a demon to be chased by fire? Or chased by a rajm, something after it? And chased by it or burned by it? And does the demon die? Does the demon survive? Does the demon, play hide and seek? Well, who knows? We don't know. Other than the question, though, is why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us about this? And it turns out it has nothing to do with making us wonder about whether demons are chased away. Whichever way you research it, you will find in all three places that the Quran mentions this, the primary objective was to underscore for Muslims that the age of soothsayers and the age of those who claimed to know the future, or what do you call these
fortune tellers? Fortune tellers.
Fortune tellers. Fortune tellers is over. That it is not a part of the belief system of a Muslim to believe in fortune tellers. And that is why the Prophet ﷺ, exactly in the context of commenting on this verse, says that if any Muslim who goes to a fortune teller and believes the fortune teller, they have left Islam, meaning that their iman has been... one of the things that I don't know why, but it's never taught to any of the people who do tafsir in the modern age, is a very close but different understanding of this same verse. There, an old... I found this among some of the earlier tafsir that said that rujuman al-shayateen means it didn't read it understood the verse, we'll say figuratively, that willed that the earth have masabih, meaning stars, planets, so on. But rujum al-shayateen means, I'll read it first in Arabic. أي سبب ظنون وجهالات للشياطين وهم الشياطين المنجمون المرجفون الذين يرجمون بالغيب. So it understood it as saying, first the shayateen that it's referring to are not the shayateen of jinn, but the shayateen of human beings. That's first. Second, that these stars have been misused by human demons, shayateen al-ins, to spread ignorance by speculating about what they don't know. So it's a very different understanding, getting at the same meaning, but it's not then a condemnation of shayateen al-jinn in Surah al-Mulk, but a condemnation of the shayateen al-ins, and shayateen al-ins are the fortune tellers who are lying about the future. 6 is clear. والذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير. وإذا ألقوا فيها سمعوا لها شهيقا وهي تفور تكاد تميز من الغيظ كلما ألقي فيها فوج سألهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم نذير قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما نزل الله من شيء إن أنتم إلا في ضلال كبير. وقالوا لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في أصحاب السعير فاعترفوا بذنبهم فسحقا لأصحاب السعير. This is up to verse 11. So next it talks about disbelievers, and again I'm flagging the most important issues that come up with that when they are cast in hellfire, what is heard is shahiq. How did Study Quran translate shahiq? The caster in, they will hear it blaring as it boils over, well nigh bursting with rage. Shahiq is, well, okay. Blaring as it boils over, we'll hear it blaring as it boils over, relies on a problematic hadith that says that people will be thrown in hellfire like wood is thrown in a pit of fire. And then the fire goes, like, the way fire ignites as you throw wood in it. But that's shahiq is more subtle than that. Shahiq is, it's like when you take a breath in, so when you go, that's a shahiq. As zafir, when you expel a breath out. So the thing that theologians pause at is that the language is that you hear hell simmering as if it is or تكاد تميز من الغيظ, that it is as if it is glaring with rage, or غيظ is like frustration. It's not even rage, but it's like frustration. Because frustration over what? Over people being sent to hellfire, the fact that they ended up with that fate. So, of course, because our ancestors took the Quran far more seriously than we do, they had these discussions. Well, how could that connotes that hellfire is as if a living being? So some commentators said, well, it's not referring to hellfire because hellfire cannot be a living being. It's referring to those the guards over hellfire, that those who make the sound and those who question people who enter hellfire and say, didn't you get a warner? Didn't you get a messenger? Didn't you hear about the message? And the people say, yes, we've heard the message, but we ignored it. Are the guards. That's one view. The second view is, well, actually, I'm sorry, I forgot the Sufi-esque view. The Sufi-esque view is that, again, it's metaphorical. That there's actual guards are not going to be, but it is to convey the frustration or the lost position of those who will be shielded away from the sight of God. يُحْجَبُ عَنِ اللَّهِ. That by being shielded away from the sight of God that's true hellfire, it's true loss, and that it is telling them, think about your situation as if you are being questioned. Couldn't you have prevented yourself from falling in that fate? The third view is, other than the very literal one, where people are being tossed into a raging fire, is that in fact Jahim, and they rely on a number of reports, is that in fact Jahim is like a living creature that is aware of who enters it. That, which is interesting, that they draw this parallel, that in the same way that earth itself is living, hellfire is living. And that whether figuratively in the same way that the mountains speak, where Allah offers the trust to the mountains and say, and they refuse to carry it, and they say, whether in the same way people will not actually hear hellfire, have the shahiq, have that deep breath in, but the important thing is to convey the meaning that hellfire, it will be aware of their coming in and will be unhappy, will be in fact very frustrated with people having ended up where they are. Okay. Okay. So every time that they're thrown in, the guards will ask them, haven't you received a messenger? ألم يأتكم نذير قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما أنزل الله من شيء. That, didn't you get a messenger? Didn't you get a warner? And they will say, yes, but we said Allah didn't send anything. There is a theological debate that, again, I should flag. The theological debate is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَمْ يَأْتِكُمْ نَذِيرٌ, a messenger. Elsewhere Allah says that Allah, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ, that Allah doesn't punish without sending a messenger. Okay, now, is the messenger that constitutes sufficient notice to then be sufficient cause for punishment? Must that messenger be a prophet, or those that convey the message of a prophet? داعي يدعو إلى الله. So if you haven't received a prophet and you haven't received a da'i, a teacher, someone who's coming and telling you about a prophet, then you haven't received the nazir. Then you're off the hook. And then the only question is what you should have known innately and intuitively. Al-Rasul al-Batin. But that's a separate matter. There is a huge difference, because if you say that the issue is whether you received a da'i, yad'u ila Allah, other words, a teacher. On the one hand, a lot of people who wouldn't be considered to have received notice would be in trouble. But on the other hand, what if the quality of the da'wah is really bad? What if the da'i alladhi yad'u ila Allah misrepresents what the Prophet taught? Put it differently, does it suffice that the Quran is there, available for whoever to read? Now, what if you read the Quran, but you don't understand it? What if you read the Quran, but you're not aided by people who allow you to understand the Quran in a way that is true to the Quran's message? You can see why these would become very serious theological issues, and why that simple verse, I mean, it's repeated elsewhere in the Quran, but because Surah Mulk is supposed to be one of the earlier revelations that states it in precisely in that fashion, and for a variety of and because of the importance of Surah Mulk, I mean, read what Al-Razi writes about this, for instance, which is very fascinating. Now, the other thing is, notice when it comes to Ayah 11, وَقَالُوا لَوْ كُنَّا نَسْمَعُ أَوْ نَعْقِلُ مَا كُنَّا فِي أَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ. They say, if we 11,
10.
is it what?
10.
Oh, 10. They say, had we listened or had we understood? Okay. why does it say listen before naql? Naql is reason, understood, comprehend. And nasma is listen. This gave rise to another discussion. Is proper listening a precondition to proper comprehension? Not proper listening meaning that if you're deaf then, but rather, what if you, it goes back to the issue of a da'i, the teacher. What if you listen but you hear the wrong thing? What you hear is something that misrepresents the message. Now, of course, this was especially in the age of that most of the tafsir were written in before the communication revolution. I mean, it was extremely pertinent because so much of the world was illiterate and so much of the world had not been exposed to Islam. I mean, so much of the world had not ever seen a Quran or heard of a Quran, and but ironically, because of that, the way you see, for instance, Mormons today and Christians today, where they constantly are sending evangelists around the world, this is the way Muslims discharge the obligation of getting notice. So they would send dua. Some of these dua acted internally within the Islamic State, and some of them, like the Fatimiyin, especially the Dawah al-Fatimiyya and this whole thing, but armies of proselytizers were being out, many of them at the same time sort of acting as merchants, would go out and try to spread the Islamic message. In the modern age, nothing causes as much confusion as this precise point. And here's the scary thing about the whole issue of Islamophobia. It's easy to think of what type of sin the Islamophobes are going to incur in the hereafter, because they have so much hate in their heart. They literally invite the demonic into their life. But the failure to respond to Islamophobia and the corruption of the Islamic message, while it might get off so many Muslims, might get so many Muslims, so many non-Muslims off the hook, because all they've heard is pretty disturbing stuff. It might get so many Muslims condemned, because if there's a fundamental failure in the da'wah, so how does that dynamic of لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل, if we could listen or reason, we wouldn't have. Is the question going to be directed to Muslims? Why didn't you communicate what people could? It's terrifying. I mean, it's really, and part of the problem is our modern theologians are completely oblivious to this point. Tariq Swedan, who I had a conversation with, the famous da'iyah from Kuwait, dared to address this point in a lecture he gave in Arabic. And he suggested that it is against Allah's justice to hold people who only had an opportunity to be misinformed about Islam accountable. And so many people attacked him all over the Muslim world. I mean, there were like people doing all types of videos and it is that exactly that type of reaction that has discouraged so many modern theologians from dealing with this issue head on. Because I think the point he was raising was extremely valid. I mean, if the style of the Quran in translation especially, it's really disingenuous to say the Quran in translation constitutes sufficient notice. So what if the people then what if the message about the Quran is being misrepresented and Muslims don't even, I mean, how many Muslims even speak languages or understand the epistemology of their age or understand the way that people think? Or, if the da'wah of Muslims today is still thinks that the height of knowledge is to memorize the isnad of this hadith and memorize the isnad of that hadith and to repeat the methods of systems of knowledge that used to exist centuries ago, how can then you say it's consistent with God's justice to punish people for failing to know? But then what type of accountability does this put on Muslims? So this is the thing that has, when it says in 11, فَاعْتَرَفُوا بِذَنْبِهِمْ فَسُحْقًا لِأَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ فَاعْتَرَفُوا بِذَنْبِهِمْ. So they admitted they confessed their sin. They confessed their fault. Okay, so what if the question is directed to us in the hereafter? What have you done about the da'wah? Why is it that you've stopped sending qualified da'iyas for centuries? Centuries, literally. I mean, the Azhar was used to send dua still up to the 60s, but Azhar has not produced qualified dua since the 1800s. And that's Azhar. Now, India used to send dua, but India has not sent dua since India stopped being a Muslim nation. So India has been absent from the playing field for a long time. That's it. So we have been absent from the world of da'wah since the 1800s. I mean, about 50 years before the fall of the Ottoman Empire or so. And who became the dua? Well, the ones sent by the Saudi government, they usually went to Muslims to advocate basically Wahhabi Islam. The ones sent by Azhar, grossly unqualified. Other Islamic institutions like Jamiat Qarawin and so on have not sent anyone forever. Or places like Timbuktu, which used to be very active, has been off the map for centuries. And then, so who emerged on the scene? People like Jamaat al-Tabligh, which I used to go around with. when I was very young. And Jamaat al-Tabligh, from personal experience, are clueless. But their da'wah is not even to non-Muslims. Their da'wah is to Muslims. We would go knock at the doors of Muslim homes and basically could say, come to a dars in the mosque. That was the extent of the da'wah. And of course, 99% of people would stand you up, ignore you, and the 1% that would show up, basically because they're bored and had nothing else to do, or because. But it was all. The level of education. It was really the most unintelligent people. This was before the Egyptian Revolution, and so things have gotten worse since then. But before Sisi came to power, of course, after Sisi came to power, things got much, much worse. But I was at Azhar, and they. I was sort of a guest, and they had me meet with the head of the Dawah division. And the head of the Dawah division, this is the guy who's responsible for Dawah in Europe, Dawah in Africa, Dawah in Asia. So he very proudly showed me, I think it was a paper that was about 50 pages. He said, we just finished writing our, basically a Dawah manifesto for all our shuyukh to use all around the world. That would be translated in any language we can translate it to, and he was very, very proud of it. And I read it, I nearly cried. It was dumb. It was dumb. Dumb. Yes, he thought it was very smart, but it was truly dumb. Islam is in your heart. It is your fitrah. Just ask yourself. You will see that you're really a Muslim. Allah wants you to wash yourself in the river 5 times a day. Isn't that beautiful? You'll be so clean. Meaning pray 5 times a day. That was the thing. So 12 إن الذين يخشون ربهم بالغيب لهم مغفرة وأجر كبير وأسروا قولكم واجهروا به إنه عليم بذات الصدور ألا يعلم من خلق وهو اللطيف الخبير. 12, 13, and 14. Those يخشون ربهم بالغيب, those يخشون is often translated as fear, but يخشون means are thoroughly mindful of God, because al-khashya is to be constantly aware of something. Al-khashya is not al-khawf. Al-khashya is to be thoroughly mindful of God, although God, bil-ghayb means, and bil-ghayb here is whether they are seen or unseen, or whether even if God is unseen. So both. وَأَسِرُّوا قَوْلَكُمْ أَوْ اجْهَرُوا بِهِ, whether you say something publicly or outwardly or not, Allah knows what is in the hearts. أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ الْلَطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. This is actually, as short as this ayah is, it's profoundly beautiful. isn't it obvious that God would know what God created? So now, again, we go back to those people who used to take the Quran far more seriously than we did. This ayah, you'll find in many of the tafsir, they'll talk about how reflecting on this ayah alone would guide your heart towards belief. Because if the first issue is whether Allah, there is a God or there's no God, and that's an issue of, can this created world with all its sophistication and all its intentionality and purpose exist without a creator? Once you reach the point of believing in a creator, then for a creator not to have accountability and not to have resurrection would be a vain creator. In other words, would be someone who created out of pure vanity with no purpose. So created and abandoned. And that's inconsistent with the magnanimity of a creator. A creator who just simply creates and says, well, now I've created you, just exist and die, I have nothing to do with you. A creator that knows what as a creator, that creator created, means intimate involvement in the affairs of that creation. And intimate involvement in the affairs in that creation would lead one to a realization that there has to be a vindication of justice among created things at the end. Because otherwise, then there would be no accountability, and God would have enabled the strong to eat the weak without recourse. Verse 15, هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور. Again, just the beauty of the language is amazing. جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا. It's pointing the obvious. Ponder this earth. The earth, by the nature of what you see as the processes, the dynamics of creation, the earth could be made extremely inhospitable. For parts of the earth to become flat and parts of the earth to sustain soil and to preserve water. And that point about water is really important because we come back to it at the very end. And for it to sustain vegetation and growth, it means an intentionality that made al-ard zalul. Zalul means open to habitation. I think the study Quran translates it as tractable. But zalul means it's actually something that you can achieve dominion over and control for your life. While if you look at volcanoes, you look at the way oceans form, the way mountains form, you would know that the natural dynamics of things is not to make territory or not to make geography that is dalul, not to make geography that you can actually achieve dominion over. To form rock formations that are actually not hospitable to life. So that hospitality to life itself is evidence of points to your Creator. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَامْشُوا فِي مَنَاكِبِهَا, that term manakib, by the way, was pointed out by so many linguists as, because we don't have it used in pre-Islamic poetry in that sense. Manakib is used in pre-Islamic poetry. Is used in pre-Islamic Arabic, but in reference to cattle, not in this type of context. It's saying, so walk in its, how does the Quran, walk in its, this is verse what?
15.
Is this 15? So open roads. I was looking for see if they have a better word. Manakibha. So, yeah, travel in its far reaches. Travel in the valleys, the valleys, the roads. But the way that the expression is, it's like saying travel in the roads that Allah created. It's that these natural valleys or natural passageways that, and the implication here is that this in itself is an indication of the Creator. That you think that this is just happenstance, it's not. That when things do look like they're pathways that facilitate your travel, it's exactly what Allah intended. And travel upon this earth and ponder that fact. وَإِلَيْهِ النُّشُورِ. But ever be mindful that return will always be to Allah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاصبا فستعلمون كيف نذير. So this is now 16 and 17. The study Quran translates it as, do you feel secure that he who is in the heaven will not cause the earth to engulf you while it churns, or do you feel secure that he who is in heaven will not unleash a torrent of stones upon you? Soon shall you know how my warning is. Okay, so أأمنتم من في السماء يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور. It's not I mean, do you feel secure conveys the meaning, but in a very raw, vulgar way. It's like saying, it's like saying to you, aren't you worried, or do you worry that what will happen after you retire? Or if I say to you, do you worry what will happen if you lose your health? So, amintum, it does imply a threat, but it's one is in part addressed to the Meccans, but beyond the Meccans, it's as if saying, you traverse upon this earth, you find this earth secure and safe for your life. You build, you make plans, you organize your life on the assumption that this earth is. But it is reminding you that it is God's active act of mercy and God's consistent intervention that keeps the earth friendly to your existence. So, in 16, it's like, it's saying, it would, do you not worry that whatever is in Sama, and we'll get to this point about Manfi Sama, that whatever comes from the Sama, whatever comes from the heavens, would in fact annihilate your life as you know it. Or, juxtaposed to what is in the Sama, what is in the heavens, is that the earth itself would annihilate life as you know it. Now, of course, in you find in some sources they'll talk about, is it talking about rain? Is it talking about earthquakes? It doesn't matter. It's juxtaposing that both the dynamics of the if you will, the physics or the law, the processes of life on earth, the earth itself needs to work perfectly, and the atmosphere surrounding the earth needs to work perfectly for your life to exist the way it does. One of them goes wrong, and it's all over. So it's pointing your attention to something obvious, but we ignore it all the time anyway. That your life is very precarious and very vulnerable. It is far more vulnerable than you realize, and it is God's consistent intervention and consistent act of grace that allows you to have the stability and predictability that you do as much as you ignore it. Now, where it says, أَمِنْتُمْ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاءِ, this actually, again, it gave Quranic commentators a pause. Why does it say man fi sama, that which is in heavens, instead of saying, are you, instead of referring to God directly? Some said, well, maybe it's talking about angels. Maybe it's saying, how do you know that angels are not going to destroy life on earth? Others said, well, no, that doesn't make sense because angels only act upon God's command. Some said, well, it's a way of referring to God. And that gave rise to another discussion. Of course, this is not the only place in the Quran, but all these discussions centered around Surah Al-Mulk because of the importance of Surah Al-Mulk. Can you say that God is located in the heavens? So Ja'far al-Sadiq, in commenting upon Surah Al-Mulk, said the following about this verse. I'll first read it in Arabic. Some people were saying, well, this is clear proof that Allah is, in fact, Allah's location is up in the skies. And Ja'far al-Sadiq said, من زعم أن الله في شيء أو على شيء أو من شيء فقد أشرك. إذ لو كان في شيء لكان محصورا أو كان على شيء كان محمولا أو كان من شيء كان محدثا. So he's saying, whoever claims that Allah is inside of a place or on top of a place or from a place, then they have committed shirk. Because if God was in a place, then that place would limit God's being. And if God was on a place, then that place would carry God. And if God was from a place, then that means that God is created. And all of them are shirky ideas. This, of course, this whole debate, it's like the tip of an iceberg in Islamic theology, because among the Ahl al-Hadith, who not even if they were amorphists, not necessarily if they believed in amorphism, but although many of them did, but in response to a lot of Sufi beliefs that Allah has no specific place, that Allah is everywhere, and that Allah permeates and pervades everything, they would insist that Allah has indeed a location in the heavens on a throne. But that idea struck many Muslim theologians, and as the reason I quoted Ja'far al-Sadiq in this context specifically is many Muslim theologians, not necessarily rationalists, not necessarily Sufi, not necessarily, but going even from the very beginning of the Islamic message, that struck many Muslim theologians as an amorphous idea, that God would be explicitly in a even to say that God is in the heavens. is unacceptable. That all you can say is that God is all pervasive, all present, but without specifying a location. I'm just, flagging some what constitutes these long discussions that go on forever. Okay. But I don't think that this whole issue about man fi sama, I don't think that the debate about whether it's angels or God or so on, I think the reason that Allah says man fi sama is that Allah is alerting us to the precariousness of life, whether considered from the perspective of what envelops the earth or considered from this perspective of planet Earth itself. Okay. Then 18, there's nothing I can say about 18. I mean, it's obvious. There are some who disbelieved before, and they were, and have you, كيف كان نكير, have you pondered their fate? Again, Allah repeatedly in Surah Mulk, Allah doesn't mention any particular tribes or past nations, but throughout the Quran, see how often Allah calls upon us to reflect upon history. This is, although I said I'm not going to comment on it, I can't stop myself. Okay, listen. Do you know that human beings, forget the Orientalists, forget the Islamophobes, forget Islam through the eyes of its colonizers. Put Islam through the eyes of its colonizers to the side. Do you know that before Muslims, the practice of writing history was on very, very poor footing in human society? I mean, look at how many attempts at writing chronicles and annals of history in the Greek civilization or in the Roman civilization or in the Christian civilization before Islam. It is clear. Of course, Islam through the eyes of its colonizers tells you, oh, Muslims weren't really writing history. They were just writing chronicles. They were doing ta'rikh, not tarikh. I mean, God, where do I? Don't. I'm trying to hold myself back, so I don't unleash on ta'rikh and tarikh and stupidity of God. You want to colonize people, so you dumb them down, you strip them of all their accomplishments. It's old news. But the fact of the matter is, very little was written in terms of human memory before Islam. In Greek civilization, in the Roman civilization, in Muslims, because of the Quran, because of how often the Quran told Muslims to study history, with the birth of the Islamic civilization, started writing not just historical chronicles, but numerous historical chronicles. I mean, so many that I have tons I mean, the guys here, the students here, were commenting about the history section, and they were cracking jokes about the history section because of how enormous and endless it is. Because it's, and I'm talking about pre-modern works. I mean, just, history. And this, and we haven't even organized the manuscripts. I mean, we've just organized the printed stuff on history. We haven't organized the manuscripts on history. Because there's so much history that's not even published that Muslims wrote. When it comes to modern Muslims, they are the worst students of history on planet Earth. It blows my mind. How did we go from the pioneers of history, like we were the pioneers of chemistry, and we were the pioneers in physics, and we were the pioneers in optics, and we were the pioneers in sociology. But how did we even go from the pioneers in history to absolutely we're not even ranked. We're not even there when it comes. How does that? I mean, of course, we can say colonialism, but how did we allow those who colonized Muslims to convince us that we are so worthless? How did we believe them to that extent? Now, there are a lot of people that publish works, quote unquote, on history in the Muslim world. But all of it is derivative and worthless. Meaning, all of it reads what is produced in Western scholarship and either plagiarizes or copies or cheats, or you can't find a book of history published in Turkish or Arabic that doesn't cite to an army of Western historians. It really rips your heart out and stomps on it. And this is the ayah that I said I'm not going to comment on. Okay, moving on. Obviously, we're not going to do Surah Al-A'la. I don't know. I'm hopeless. Just... I don't know. Sometimes you just read too much. There is such thing as too many books.
Do we have that on recording?
I'll take some.
Oh, Rami said I'll take some. Yeah, Rami's always asking me to give him my books. So this mood won't last for very long, Rami. My book hating phase only lasts for a minute or two, and then it goes away. And then I want more books. Oh, Grace, did you order my books? Alhamdulillah. Okay. I'm ordering a how many volumes is it?
43. 43.
43 volume set. Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah, soon we'll not have any more space in this house and we'll have to move out. Okay, where are we? 18? No. 19? 19. Okay. Oh, yeah. This is one of the most beautiful verses in the entire Quran. أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا إِلَى الطَّيْرِ فَوْقَهُنَّ صَافَّاتٍ وَيَقْبِضْ وَمَا يُمْسِكُهُنَّ إِلَّا الرَّحْمَنُ إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ بَصِيرٌ. Look how it goes from, think of the precariousness of life on earth. But then when it wants to get you to reflect upon how gentle or how precarious, or not even precarious, but how intricate life on earth is, it takes you to one of the most magnificent sights, a bird flying in the air. And it says, reflect on this bird, which again is an indication of, when it's telling you precarious, it's not just telling you about your own life, but life on earth. A bird flying in the air. ما يقبضهن ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير. This interestingly gives another big rise to another big discussion. When Allah says that it is only held by Ar-Rahman, does it mean that anything that floats anything that floats on the sea and anything that flies in the air, whether a bird or an insect, or in our modern age, I guess, planes, that Allah directly exercises a will to hold that thing up? Or does it mean that Allah's will is enacted through the laws of nature? Now, of course, in our modern age, we'd say things like the laws of gravity and whatever other physical laws. But it's interesting that even in centuries ago, and there are two camps. I mean, even very sophisticated philosophers like Mullah Sadra, for instance, who said, no, it is not just the laws of nature, but the laws of nature themselves need the active creative act of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on a constant renewed basis to preserve the laws of nature. So, for instance, that gravity itself is not just a law that God creates and leaves to function, but God consistently has to uphold the very laws that sustain nature. While the other camp doesn't see Allah's creative act on a constant moment-to-moment basis. That type of discussion gets, of course, it has its very medieval characteristic, because it goes back to an old debate in Greek philosophy. But interestingly, I'll tell you that I used to be among the believers in the camp that Allah creates laws of nature and just puts them in motion. But I've switched, that Allah is intimately engaged in a consistent act of creation for the laws of nature to persist. And it's interesting that it's science that made me switch, especially when I started reading about particles and the physics of particles, and then they reminded me of a lot of the things that I've read in the Islamic tradition, and No. Okay. 20 أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن إن الكافرون إلا في غرور. أمن هذا الذي يرزقكم إن أمسك رزقه بل لجوا في عتو ونفور. Okay, so now 19 and 20. No, sorry. 20 and 21. 20 and 21. Notice Al-Mulk is a Meccan surah, long before there's any warfare. So that reference, which is, who is it that will be a host for you, who may help you apart from the compassionate? Jundun lakum, which literally soldiers. So أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن. The reference to soldiers in this Meccan surah is interesting because often in light of the Medinian experience, the way of understanding ayahs like this was to say, well, it's saying real victory comes, military victory comes from Allah. But this is, if you keep in mind that Mulk is a Meccan surah, this is not what it's saying. But literally, where does your aid come from other than from the Rahman? As jund here, although normally translated as soldiers, but it's aid. Okay. بل لجوا في عتو ونفور. This is where it deserves that we so on the same theme as the extent to which Allah calls upon you to recognize how dependent you are, how life in itself is dependent on the Rahman, on the most compassionate. If Allah would will that a risk is not your individual earnings, or it could cover, it could apply to that as well. But if Allah would will that methods of sustenance on this earth would end, as well as your individual livelihood would end, it would. The very dynamics that allow for the cycle of life to continue would come to a screeching halt. But then بل لجوا في عتو ونفور, but they obstinately, stubbornly can get caught up in utu. Is istikbar al-watuyan. Utu is when one becomes full of themselves. Al-utu is when you start becoming a sort of a haughty, arrogant attitude. ونفور شرود عن الحق. النفور الشرود عن الحق. Nufur is when you forget the path of righteousness. And in this context, وَلَجْرُ فِي عُتُوٌ وَنُفُورٍ, that they will argue, although if they know how precarious life on this earth is and how intricate it is. But yet, what will always cause them to be obstinate and resistant is arrogance, which consistently takes them away from the path of truth. So it again flags the human tendency to, with all hubris, assume itself independent and assume itself capable of what it is indeed not capable of, and to consistently ignore the role of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the persistence of life as we know it. Okay. Then أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم قل هو الذي أنشأكم. First, let's take 22. أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه. A person who's a mukib is someone who walks with their head down. That's a mukib. They have their head down like this. And they're incapable of seeing what is around them. And as a result, as they walk, they keep stumbling. While the other, so the rhetorical question is this person on the more guided or a person who walks on the straight path? Now, the irony is, think about this. A person who's a mukib is not walking in a straight path. They're free to walk anywhere, right? They're free to walk anywhere. A person who's on a straight path is walking on a straight path. But the person who is mukib can go right, can go left, can go whichever direction. But they can't see what is around them. Their gaze is lowered. So they actually can't see. While the person who's on a Sirat al-Mustaqim, they can see what is around them, but they choose to walk on a straight path. So, translation. Those you think you are free to go wherever you want, but in fact, you live blinded by your ego, and because you're blinded by your ego, you will keep falling on your face. A perfect warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as to the fate of humanity without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will keep, not only will you fall on your face, but you will go left, you will go right, you will go front, you will go back, you will go all directions. You will think you're free, but you're blind. While those who are on a Sirat al-Mustaqim, they can see freely, and because they see freely, they walk the straight path. Yet again, but in a profoundly eloquent way. A believer walking on a Sirat al-Mustaqim cannot be mukib, meaning cannot be blind. A believer must be able to see freely. Translate this into all the numerous implications. A believer who's ignorant doesn't see freely. A believer who doesn't live the age, doesn't live or doesn't understand the systems of knowledge of their day and age can't be someone who sees freely. I mean, to say mukibban ala wajh is someone who is ignoring the obvious. Literally someone whose gaze is fixed downwards and cannot turn either right or left, up or down. But that who walks on a straight path, it must be from the ability to see freely and with comprehension. And that's why it follows that immediately by saying, قُلْ هُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَكُمْ وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. That's why it follows that with, God gave you your hearing, your sight, and your hearts, but you are not grateful. Because your hearing, your sight, and your heart is necessary in order for you not to be a muqib, ala wajh, in order to be able to see with the type of insight that allows you to walk on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. Okay, and then the comment on 24 and 25, that only Allah knows when the hereafter is. And then when the hereafter comes, فَلَمَّا رَأَوْهُ زُلْفَةً سِيئَتْ وُجُوهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَقِيلَ هَذَا الَّذِي كُنْتُمْ بِهِ تَدَّعُونَ. هذا الذي به كنتم به تدعون. That when the time comes, سِيئَتْ وُجُوهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, let's see how they translate it, 27. Yeah, Study Quran translates it as, the faces of those who disbelieved shall be stricken. سِيئَتْ وُجُوهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا means you will see the sign of being surprised, unpleasantly surprised, clearly on their faces. It's from Saw, that it's as if their faces will darken with grief as they realize that what they lived denying turned out to be right. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَهْلَكَنِي اللَّهُ وَمَنْ مَعِي أَوْ رَحِمَنَا فَمَنْ يُجِيرُ الْكَافِرِينَ مِنْ عَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ قُلْ هُوَ الرَّحْمَنُ آمَنَّا بِهِ عَلَيْهِ تَوَكَّلْنَا فَسَتَعْلَمُونَ مَنْ هُوَ فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. So, again, 28 and 29 underscores the dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَهْلَكَنِي اللَّهُ وَمَنْ مَعِي. If Allah would will an end to me, here it's talking to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. and those with me. Or if Allah or Allah wishes mercy upon me and those with me. And then 29, قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين. An affirmation that this is Allah that we believe in, the Rahman that we believe in, and that we rely on, and you will come to know who in fact amongst us or between us is wrong. But notice how Surah Al-Mulk then ends. قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتيكم بماء معين. It comes to this point. Consider if you're in أصبح ماؤكم غورا, if your water, غور means if it would evaporate, what would become of you? Now, so many commentators say, why does Surah Mulk end this way? It doesn't end with a statement about an affirmation of faith, but simply gets to that point about water and then stops. Think about the entire thrust of Surah Al-Mulk. If you wanted to summarize Surah Al-Mulk, you would say what? Surah Al-Mulk, from beginning to end, emphasizes that you might think that your life on this earth and the life of other beings on this earth is autonomous, independent, but in fact it is completely dependent on God's consistent intervention and mercy. And if you ponder this, you would see that this is obvious. That whether the heavens or earth, everything is maintained within an intricate balance. That it would quickly evaporate, quickly be undone without God's intimate involvement in upholding and maintaining and persevering and preserving this life. Now, what does Allah tell us is what made all life possible on earth? Water. That Allah made from water everything alive. What does Allah warn us is the one thing that if Allah takes away, all of life would be undone. Water. So it's like saying, you don't think about this, but it's as easy as making your ma' ghawr. It's as easy as making water evaporate. Making water dry up. and all of the what you imagine to be would be undone. The wise would ponder just the miracle of water, the way it exists, and the way that it sustains life, and what is needed for it, and that would become, would start the journey of, and that's why it is not simply to walk the Sirat Mustaqim. It really requires a breadth of knowledge, a curiosity about history, a curiosity about life, a curiosity about nature, as opposed to someone who is walking mukibban ala wajhi and lost, whichever way that takes him. But let's go back then now, why would Surah Al-Mulk be revealed before the Hijrah? We said at the beginning it's either middle Meccan period or late Meccan period. And I said that I believe it's late Meccan period. I think you will see a pattern that we have a series of surah after the Isra and before the Hijrah that relay critical society building messages to Muslims. And we've talked about several of these, not all of them, but several of them. That it's like telling them, okay, if you're going to build a civilization, here's what you need. And we've talked about, at the most basic level, like Luqman and Zukhruf and so on. But then after it's done, was communicating this to them, there are a series of surah, short surah, revealed right before the Hijrah, powerfully and succinctly reminding Muslims of the lesson that every imperial power forgets. That you might become a great power, but the edifice of power that you will construct is a facade and a lie. You are in real trouble the minute you forget your utter dependence on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In a very concrete way. The minute that you start doing things forgetting, inshallah, you start doing things forgetting Assalamu alaikum. You start doing things forgetting Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You start doing things forgetting A'udhu Billah minash Shaitan ar-Rajim. All these elementary things, because your power, your economic power, your military power, your power as a superpower is building up. But that's actually where you are most in danger. And I think that is why after the Quran, right before the Hijrah, finishes communicating these state-building lessons to Muslims in surah like Surah Al-Shura and Surah Ibrahim and of course Luqman, which we've talked about. So right before the Hijrah, there are a number of short surah, all of which communicate that same basic lesson. You are utterly and completely vulnerable and dependent on Allah's beneficence. Don't you dare forget that. Both as a community but also individually. At the individual level, the most significant imagery to take from Surah Al-Mulk, in my view, and Allahu A'lam, is precisely the image of the person who walks with their face cast downwards, free to walk wherever they want, but also free to fall and stumble wherever they want. As opposed to Sirat al-Mustaqim, which takes a lot of enlightenment and a lot of intelligence, but it is a conscientious path of awareness. I think that is it for Surah Al-Mulk. Yeah, if I remember anything, so I'll bring it up. Okay.
Oh yeah, hi guys, we're back, interactive. If you want to turn your cameras on, we can see the lovely Noor in your face. Okay, any questions from the audience, studio audience?
I have a question.
Okay, please. Say it loudly so everyone can hear.
Several times in the Quran you get an expression of the reason behind creation. So, لعلكم تعبدون, لعلكم تشكرون, لنبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. How do they fit together?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay, the question, this is a good question. The Quran, at several points, will have remarks like, so لعلكم تشكرون, so you may be grateful, or لعلكم تعبدون, so you may worship, or لنبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا, so that we will see which of you will be, which of you will be better in deeds, as in Surah Al-Mulk, ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. And the question is, how do they fit together? They're actually, I mean, they are in part answers when the لعلكم تفيد التمني, that it's an expression that connotes how do I put it, hopefulness, or like saying in hope that you will do. So it by its nature, it doesn't connote the reason for things. So if I say I am studying لعلي أنجح, so لعلي أنجح doesn't mean that the sole reason I am studying is so that I may pass, but it connotes my hope is by studying I will pass. But I could be studying for many other reasons. So I could be studying because, I want to pass. I could be studying because I want a career. Because I could be studying because my father is going to get me a present. I could be studying because someone is holding a gun to my head. The expression لعلي or لعلكم doesn't connote the reason for something. It just connotes a tamanni, that in the hope of. And the hope of is a partial view of why you want something, not a total view. when, as in Surah Al-Mulk, say, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ, that connotes objective, a purpose. Or when you say, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْإِنسَ وَالْجِنَّ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, here, لِيَعْبُدُونَ, it again connotes objective, purpose. But if we talked about what at-ta'abbud means, and at-ta'abbud, in the sense that we've talked about, is completely consistent with the idea that we've created you so to see which of you will perform better. And gratitude is part of a better performance. It's not the total better performance, but it's a component of a better performance. And ta'abbud itself is a component of, again, ahsanu amala, which of you is better in deeds. So these two parts is that all of them are consistent with a single theme. That's one. But two, not every expression of aliyah, la'al, is an expression of purpose. But as in Surah Al-Mulk, this is a clear expression of purpose. This is not a question, but I wanna. This is something I forgot about Surah Al-Mulk. Al-Mulk is one of the surah that there was an attempt early on in the Islamic civilization, especially it started in the Umayyad period, and continued. Continued to different degrees, to different extents, to use this idea of al-mulk, يؤتي الملك من يشاء ويعز من يشاء ويذل من يشاء بغير حساب, to argue that since mulk is in Allah's hands, and Allah gives mulk to whomever Allah wishes, that this is God's will, and the way it was used by political forces is to basically argue that it is Allah's will to put whoever is in power, to give mulk to whoever Allah wills. And when Allah wills to give mulk to someone, you may not object or protest or oppose. And Surah Al-Mulk is one of these surah that there was an attempt to co-opt it in that way. And the response to this is in part provided by theologians themselves, depending of course on the theological orientation of the theologian. But overall, while it is true that we must assume that whatever transpires on earth is Allah's will. So it is Allah's will that whoever is in power in Syria is in power. Whoever is in power in Egypt is in power. Whoever is in power in the US is in power. While that is true, but that doesn't get us off the hook. That only poses a further question, and that is our role in making Allah's will what it is. So if if Trump was in power, it's Allah's will in response to our amal. It is Allah's will in response to our failure to vote Trump out of office. In other words, it is not at all the case that you can use Surah Al-Mulk or similar ayat to justify tyranny, because Allah's will is in response to your amal, to your deeds. If your deeds are good, Allah's will follows from that. If your deeds are bad, Allah's will follows from that. Allah's will is consistently, in the same way that it interacts with creation, it consistently interacts with our will. And so it doesn't, and I say this because, of course, there is a very strong orientation today, all over the US. And in fact, there is this guy who sent me the curriculum of what's taught at the Yaqeen Institute, and leave alone places like Zaytuna, but even like the Yaqeen Institute. And they told me, look, they teach us in the Yaqeen Institute that whoever is in power because God wants them to be in power, and you just have to accept tyrants the way they are, and you have to accept injustice the way it is, because that's all Allah's will. And that's just, that's an absolute corruption of the entire point of Islam and the entire objective of the Quran. And only an ignorant human being would reach that type of conclusion.
Thanks, Sheikh. Any more questions?
Thank you, Sheikh. You spoke briefly about the debates surrounding why in verse 1 they use the term biyadihi, like in his hand.
Yeah.
And then you went on to describe the difference between Subhan and Tabarak, and why Tabarak would make more sense. Implicitly, you answer that it would make more sense for Tabarak to be used because it's above materiality versus above non-materiality. And I'm wondering if that precise definition essentially answers the debate in a sense, because the usage then would make sense, because if you know what Tabarak means, then it would almost necessitate to then present something that is physical. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's saying that biyadihi tabarak alladhi, right? So then it's really what it's doing is biyadihi is or biyadihi mulk, again something substantive, right? But it's kind of like you start the sentence with tabarak, and then you move forward, and then it pushes you back into reflecting on what the first word means. I'm wondering if does that make sense?
Yeah, actually that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Can you summarize, Sheikh?
I think the point is that when the first verse says Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk, that Tabarak whose sovereignty is in Allah's hands, and and I said, why does it use the word hands here? And I didn't really answer it because it gets us into all these discussions about amorphism, and and I'm not eager at all to get into it. But what Shana is saying is that if it started out with Tabarak, then it would make sense that it would use an expression of materiality, like reference to a hand. And so that's in essence, right, what you're saying. But that's a really good point, because then it would explain why it said biyadihi al-mulk instead of like tabarak alladhi lahu al-mulk, for instance.
And it hurts the claim of the anthropomorphism, right? Because it says tabarak alladhi biyadihi, so it's saying exalted above materiality.
Above materiality.
So above having hands and feet and that.
Because tabarruk is beyond materiality. So it's like saying when it comes to Allah, Allah is beyond the material. It's a really good point.
Thank you.
Two questions. What's the dhikr? It's the first one.
The entire surah is in
First mistake. The entire surah, Sheikh says.
Whole surah.
whole surah is
Whole
zikr.
surah.
This was a very powerful halaqah and very. I watched a documentary a few nights ago that in it talked about how in our society we have this almost subconscious inclination to where we value grandiosity and we value arrogance, where we actually we gravitate towards and are comforted by people that have grandiosity and have arrogance. And when we got to the part in the surah that talked about the disbelievers are not but delusion, it made me think of that, because one of the experiences that I repeatedly have had with people who have been fans of your work, whether academic or not academic, have been, it's like they have this breath of fresh air when they come in contact with the reality of of how prevalent Wahhabism is and how much it's robbed from our tradition. But I've also seen in myself, and this has changed, I went through this period where that realization, that breath of fresh air turns into, like, I call it a delusion, because we end up hating Wahhabis. And we end up looking at it as if it's the only, like, the bane of existence, and it's like if Wahhabis were gone, it would be solved.
Yeah.
But I've seen Muslims in especially in the West, and I mean I can only speak for Muslims in America. Our challenge, to me, in my opinion, is very different. And when I think about delusion, when I think about what my delusions are and what I'm gravitated towards and what I'm attracted to, what I take comfort in, what I build my security on, it's not on Allah, it's on what my society has told me. So I feel like, what if I were to word this into a question, what do you think is for us Muslims here? Because we're now getting the warning. I don't want to be one of those people on the final day who's like, Allah's like, I gave you the warning. What do you think are our most challenging delusions that we have to combat? And how does it manifest in the choices that we make in our society?
That's a hard question. No, okay, so first let me just, what Sharif was saying that yeah, there's a tendency for people who encounter my work, I have to say, I mean, I must say, encounter my work superficially, to think that what I am basically saying is Wahhabism is a problem and that's it. And to become focused on Wahhabi this, Wahhabi that, and it's superficially, because it's not. That's not. I even think Wahhabism as an actual theology was very short lived, and it's dead. It's over. Our problems are far more. It's what allowed Wahhabism to become the prevalent, dominant force for a while. What we describe as these sort of Wahhabi-like attitudes permeate even beyond the Wahhabi school. So you find it in a lot of Sufi orientations as well. The irony, I wrote this on God Knows the Soldiers a very long time ago, back in the 90s, that I said that Wahhabism is the secularizing of the Islamic religious tradition. Wahhabism secularizes. And I think a lot of our attitudes is that we we apply exceptionalist logic when it comes to the religious tradition, and I think that's, like, for me, that's one of our biggest problems as Muslims in the West. The real challenge for us is, we even have good models. If I think of a Jewish theologian like Martin Buber, for instance, or Levinas, modern Jewish theologians that managed to talk about the Jewish tradition and put it in philosophical and moral and ethical conversation with mainstream humanity. I mean, you can't read Martin Buber and that's why a lot of non-Jewish, thoroughly secular philosophers have engaged with Martin Buber. I mean, if you even just look at Martin Buber, how often he's been cited, it's very, very difficult to find a Muslim theologian cited outside works on Islamic studies. To have a Muslim theologian, I actually can't think of any. But Jewish theologians or Christian theologians, you'll often find them cited well beyond the field of Jewish studies or even comparative religion or religious studies. And that's because of the quality of thought. It's a cop-out to say, oh, it's because of a bias against Islam. Yeah, in part, but that's not really the full answer. The full answer is that the quality of thought is that these Jewish theologians graduated from the best schools. They read all the mainstream works. In their own works, they respond to mainstream, the best intellects. And I think it is taking Islam seriously. I mean, since colonialism, the colonial legacy, Islam has become relegated to extracurricular activity. And among Muslims. And even Muslims who are in the social sciences or humanities, if they're in Islamic studies, they become as myopic as Orientalists. They're sitting there talking about the origins debate about Sharia, or the role of Shafi'i versus the role of Fiqh al-Madina, the Malikis, in the birth of Islamic law. Who cares? Who cares, honestly? It's Orientalists care because that's the way they dominate Muslims, by making them marginal and unimportant. When you find then Muslims get into Islamic studies and they become like Orientalists, they sit there and they read the Risala by... How many times are we going to read the Risala by Shafi'i and write yet another article or another book about the birth of Islamic law and whether Islamic law came from this or... We don't take our tradition seriously. We don't. And I think that is the biggest challenge. And I honestly don't know how... It's easy for me to have these thoughts, but it's like in my conversation with Tariq Sweden, it said the key is how to communicate your ideas in a way that convinces those who need to be convinced. And I don't know how to do that. I mean, how do you get the Muslims who have wealth, who actually can make a difference, to listen and to see things the way that you see them, and to decide that it's not just, to worry about the final day and what we're going to say about Islamophobia when we as Muslims collectively are all asked about this. How do I convince those who have the means to lose sleep over it the way I lose sleep over it? I mean, every time I see something Islamophobic, I keep saying astaghfirullah, 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 because I'm worried about how Allah is going to hold me personally responsible for failing to respond to this. That type of shil al-ham, that type of carrying the angst about your tradition, about your making it your personal cause, your personal issue. That's a very real challenge. I mean, I really think that the reason that, people who do Islam on their spare time as critics, they sit there and they play imams and shuyukh in Islamic centers, like children playing. They pretend to be imams, they pretend to be shuyukh, they pretend to be scholars. Everyone pretends to be something. It's because in their heart of hearts, they really don't think that Allah is going to hold them accountable. They really think that the way their brain has been shaped is that they really think if they do their salah and fast their Ramadan and pay their zakah, they're going to be fine. It's not going to really matter if they pretended to be a sheikh, if they pretended to be a scholar. It's not really going to matter if they dominate the podium at Friday khutbahs or dominate if their heart of hearts, they don't really believe it's going to matter, that it's really going to make any difference in their fate. That's because of the way they were raised. Because they've been, from the milk they drank from their mother, taught them not to take Islam seriously. That Islam is not something to worry about that much. Allah will take care of it. Allah promised to protect the Quran. Allah promised to protect this religion. Khalas, don't worry. And you get the mess that we're in. I honestly, I mean, I'll be the first to admit. I mean, I'm not sure how to communicate these ideas to people so that they wake up.
Short follow-up. Do you think that part of, because I remember in a lecture you gave at the Islamic Center of Southern California about the Romanization of Christianity, that it was almost like this gutting of the religion to make people acquiescent to power structure, but it also transformed the religion into something that is just meant to comfort me personally, rather than a personal charge and giving you a mission to do. Do you think that is...
That is a huge part of it. I mean, our entire ideological thrust in modernity is that religion is like everything that is a personal preference. Its primary role is to affirm you, not to challenge you. And what challenges you is whatever you need to make a buck. What challenges you is whatever you need for your career, to make a paycheck. But religion is among the many things. It's in the same level as whether you I don't know whether you what.
You join a club, right? You join a club.
Yeah, or play chess, wear
Country
fashion.
club,
Yeah.
play golf.
It just, I mean, and that's part of the what has happened to religion in modernity, and
It's like a spiritual spa.
yes, what?
He said it's a spiritual spa.
I actually like that spiritual spa. Yeah, spiritual spa. So it's not very serious. Yeah, I like that spiritual spa.
Okay, this is a question regarding seven heavens. Can it also be allegorical, signifying different stages of man's growth and closeness towards Allah and different levels of spirituality?
This is precisely how the Sufis understand it. They don't understand seven heavens as they actually quite insistent on this point that Allah is not talking about seven heavens above. Allah is talking about seven stages of irtiqa. In another context, inshallah, I can talk about the seven stages of irtiqa, but they see it as irtiqa means spiritual elevation, and they even understand that زينا سماء الدنيا as بمصابيح وجعلناها رجوما للشياطين as a the what رجوما للشياطين, as we said, is like flames that stone or that cast away demons. They understand it as an allegory within, that the Allah created sources of illumination, and that if you recognize the sources of illumination at the first level of elevation of the first heaven, then you start a process of chasing the demons away. And only when you internalize chasing the demons, in a sense, always remembering A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem as symbolic for A'udhu Billahi Minash Shayateen, that it becomes an inherent part of you. You begin on the path of irtiqa, because they believe that the hardest point in irtiqa is that demons hold you down to the ground. I mean, it's like crabs in a barrel. They don't want you to. So the first thing is to break free. And so it's remarkable. I mean, I haven't ever read a Sufi tafsir that has read seven heavens in a literal way. I don't know. I mean, I think the Sufis are precisely right about the seven levels of elevation, but I don't know whether it's all just an allegory.
Okay, actually one more question from YouTube. What's the difference between reason and rationale? Is one good or bad?
Reason and rationale? Rationality, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we use them often interchangeably, and I probably was using them interchangeably. However, technically, reason, when we mean by reason normally propositional logic, meaning logical thinking it's like mathematical logic, where it is a precise logic thinking that avoids fallacies, that avoids mistakes in logic, and it is quite mathematical. I mean, propositional logic. You can break down all arguments into literally mathematical formulas and work through them. Rationality is a concept, I mean, that is far less formal. Rationality is anything that would be considered within the realm of the reasonable through human practices and customs. What would make rational sense in one context would not make rational sense, while reason does not vary with circumstance and social contingencies, rationality does. The way I was using them in the halaqah, I was using them interchangeably though. But I mean, if you want the technical distinction, that's it.
Thank you, Sheikh. And that's all we have time for. Tune in Friday for our khutbah and Saturday for our next halaqah.